right, Rabbosai, tonight is part 2 of the question, may a Jew enter or ascend HaBayis today? And what we succeeded in getting through last week I should say, is we underscored the machlokus between the Rambam and the Ravid, which sort of is the underpinning of any discussion that exists bisman hazeh. The Rambam says, and this is in source number 1, which we won't go over again, but I just wanted to include it in your sheet so that you would have a record of it. The Rambam says that the Kedusha, whereas the Kedusha of Eretz Yisrael is subject to change upon the departure of the Jewish people from the land of Israel, the Kedusha of the Beis HaMikdash, and by extension the HaBayis, is not subject to fluctuation. Once the temple was sanctified in the times of Shlomo, the Shekhinah never left, and it remained there permanently. And this is the distinction that the Rambam draws, and he says that because of that, even in the absence of the Beis HaMikdash, the fact that the Shekhinah has never left means that the Kedusha that was originally instituted remains. What are the ramifications of that Kedusha? A person who has a tumah that is a result of a bodily issue, like a seminal flow or a menstrual flow, such a person is tameh and may not enter into the area of the Beis HaMikdash, including the courtyards and including the outer sort of a lattice work that would be the sort of the first thing that you would encounter upon entry into the Beis HaMikdash. The same thing would be true of the Temple Mount as well. If you have one of those tumas, like Tumas Zav and Tumas Nida and Tumas Keri, presumably, you also would not be allowed to go to the Har HaBayis as well. However, if a person has Tumas Meis, if a person has the Tumah of having come in contact with death, but does not have the other kind of Tumah that I mentioned, which is the bodily issue, so then a person would not be allowed to enter into the temple, that's called Machane Shechina, but he would be allowed to enter into what's called Machane Leviyah, the Levite camp, so to speak, which is Har HaBayis before you get into the temple area. So that would be permitted. And therefore we have one potential idea of how conceivably a Jew, even Bisman Hazeh, according to the Rambam, could enter the Temple Mount without entering the Makom HaMikdash, in theory. Okay, that's the first thing. Another thing that we pointed out yesterday is the archaeology proves that what we call the Temple Mount today is larger, in fact, than the original Temple Mount. And as a result, even if a person had all forms of Tumah upon that individual, but in theory, if that person could ascertain where the ancient Har HaBayis is, and he stayed outside of where the original Har HaBayis was, he would be allowed to go up to what we call Temple Mount today, and at least be able to have a beautiful view and to be inspired or whatever else he would want to do. Now, that would seem to be where we left it off last week, and then we saw the opinion of the Ravid. The opinion of the Ravid takes issue with the Rambam and says it's diametrically the opposite, is pum fakert. He says that I take issue with the Rambam. First of all, the Rambam he's come up with his own theory on his own. There is no basis to say, argues the Ravid, that there is a distinction between Yerushalayim, or rather the Beis HaMikdash, and the rest of Eretz Yisrael. And if you are going to make a distinction, says the Ravid, I maintain that the distinction is just the opposite. That the Kedusha of the Beis HaMikdash actually departed upon the destruction of the second temple, because there is an anticipation of an even greater Kedusha coming back for the coming of Mashiach and the construction of the third temple. Whereas the Kedusha of Eretz Yisrael, because it's static and it doesn't change, is a permanent Kedusha which has never left. And it's on that basis that we have seen that the Meiri had suggested, and as well as other very, very prominent Rishonim and early Achronim had suggested that there may be a possibility. The Meiri had even said that there's a minhag that he's seen in his time, already now in the 14th century, that he's made note of the fact that there are people that go up to Har HaBayis based upon the Ravid. Now, as I'm going to demonstrate to you tonight, the major poskim, and by major poskim I mean Dayan Weiss, the Tzitz Eliezer, Rav Ovadia Yosef. They all paskin, and Rav Avraham Yitzchak Kook, all paskined like the Rambam. We paskin like the Rambam, and therefore, Bisman Hazeh, the Kiddush of the Beis HaMikdash is in full force. And as a matter of course, we're going to see that all four of these names that I mentioned to you tell us that we should not enter the Har HaBayis and even the Temple Mount, Bisman Hazeh. Getting the exact specifications of where the original Har HaBayis was and which is beyond Har HaBayis is extremely difficult. And there are many logistical issues, and not smallest among them is that if you were to allow Jews to go up to the Har HaBayis today, then you would be promoting Jews to go up who had not properly prepared themselves and would not take the proper precautions of only going up until the point where they're supposed to go. And therefore, it is promoted by the majority of poskim with a big asterisk here. There is a strong minority of poskim who disagree. But the majority of the Gedolei HaPoskim say that today a person should not ascend the Temple Mount at all. And the reason why I say that there is an asterisk is because there has been a very strong effort to counteract the flood of poskim who came out shortly after the 67 war and said that a person should not enter the Temple Mount. And in recent years, there's been a very strong effort to try and go against that, and to say that a person not only may enter the Temple Mount with taking the proper steps beforehand, but actually it's a proper thing to do, it's an appropriate thing to do. And I want to thank Shraga. I want to thank Shraga for lending me his sefer from Rav Goren on Har HaBayit. And with the first thing I want to see tonight, and we're going to spend the bulk of the time on the tshuva from Rabbi Ovadia. Rabbi Ovadia's tshuva is a tour de force, and it is very, very lengthy, and I've cut it down to about half of its original size. But as you'll note, it's still it's quite lengthy, and he brings in some fascinating ideas and fascinating historical little tidbits that I think you'll find of very, very great interest. But before we get to that, and we see why Rav Ovadia is so strongly convinced that it's not appropriate for a person to enter Har HaBayis today, the Temple Mount today, I want us to at least understand why Rav Goren was so much in favor of trying to find reasons why we should enter the Temple Mount today. So let's go to the end of the packet. And it's source number 5, and this is from Sefer Har HaBayit, pages 45 and 46. And he has a small section where he writes, Yesh lishmor al harobonut hayehudit al Har HaBayit ka'al bovat einenu. That a person should preserve the dominion, the Jewish control over Har HaBayis, like a person watches over their eye. In other words, preserving the safety of their eye, like we're the apple of God's eye. We have the Har HaBayis is the apple of the Jewish people, the apple of God's eye, and therefore we have an obligation to preserve it and make sure that it remains under Jewish control. That's the thesis that Rav Goren puts forth, and let's take a look. He says, V'hinei, k'chol she'azman choleif. Now he's writing this in Tafshin Nun Aleph, which is around 1981, that Rav Goren writes this. And he was, by the way, he was present. He helped liberate Jerusalem in 67, as you all know. And he writes as follows. He says, the more time that goes on since that time of the 67 liberation, holech v'nechelash ma'amadenu b'Har HaBayit. He says, the control that we have over Har HaBayis weakens constantly. B'yichud mizman parutz ha'intifada, anu ma'abdim shlita al Har HaBayis. And surely, especially during the times of the Intifada, I guess, was there
91.
This is 91, excuse me. This is, you're right, this is 91. So the Intifada was in like 87?
Correct.
Right? So he says, surely since the time of the Intifada, it surely has become much more difficult for us to exercise our control. Ha'irua ha'chamur biyoter shehitrachesh sham leneged einai b'chol hamoed sukkos hei tafshin nun aleph. He says the terrible thing that occurred, that I witnessed in 1991, he writes, he says, Kasher alfei porim aravim ragmu es mispalei hakosel ha'ma'aravi ba'avanim. He He says that during Chol HaMoed, you imagine there are thousands of Jews at the Kotel, and you had the Arabs standing above the Kotel throwing rocks, pelting the Jews with rocks. Lelo kol provokatsia mitzidenu, without any provocation at all from us. Ad shene'elasnu lihishtamesh negdam be'esh chaya, we had to have live fire, and there was live ammunition we had to use against them. Mashalo asinu b'milchemet hashichrur b'har HaBayit, which was not necessary. There was never a bullet fired, he says, on Har HaBayit during the 67 war. They just gave us the keys and they walked away. So you see that how degraded things have become since the time of 67, where we've had to exercise our authority using ammunition. Mikreza balamdenu shahakeniah v'haviturim lo'ivim einam mishtalmim ve'einam mekademim et hashalom. He says, you see from all of this that being obsequious and being forgiving and being foregoing and trying to be conciliatory is not going to create peace. That's not going to be the key. Ella magbirim b'kirbam et ta'avat haretzach v'hashilton. If anything, just the opposite. It stirs within them a greater desire for blood and for lording over us. Umefichim sinah neged haYehudim v'ruach karav b'libotehem shel haporeim. And again, it causes them to have tremendous hatred towards the Jews and with a spirit of violence against us. Ke'et she'anu nimtza'im tachat ivam al chayenu va'al cheirutenu. Al iyum al chayenu va'al cheirutenu. So we're living in fright as a result. Artzenu moladetenu mitzuvim anu al pi haTorah v'halacha lehafgin nochachot b'chol pina u'b'chol ezar ba'aretz. And we therefore have to fight back. We have to protest. K'moshe katuv kol hamakom asher tidroch kaf raglechem bo lachem yiheh. And we have to take back possession of our land, as the Torah says. B'chol migbala hamonat nochachot Yehudit be'ezor kolshu b'toch gvulot Eretz Yisrael shel haTorah mitpareshet al yedei oivenu kechulsha uvitur mazmin vitur nosaf ad ein sof. And basically he says that the more that we sort of abandon any territory, any parcel of land in Eretz Yisrael, it looks like we're resigning, it looks like we're giving up. And it only will engender more of this kind of spirit of dominance among the Arabs. B'nosaf al kach, HaBayit hu makom ha'acharon ba'olam alav eino anu rishayim levater. He says more than that, HaBayis is the last place in the world that we should be willing to forego. Ba'asher kol emunatenu be'avar ula'atid lavo mitchufat ha'avot ad acharit ha'yamim kishura b'har ha'moriah u'b'makom ha'mikdash. Because all of our faith in both past and future, from the times of our patriarchs until the coming of Mashiach, all of it is linked to Har HaBayis from the times of Har HaMoriah until the coming of the Mashiach and the building of the third temple. Zechutenu hahistorit v'hadatit alav bilti nitenet kalal li'irur. There is no one, except of course the Arabs. There is no one who can claim that we have no stake, we have no rights to that area. Our historical and our religious rights to that area are irrefutable. So now you see where Rav Goren is going. He says, and that's the reason why he says, I need to push on this issue and find whatever heter I can in order to be able to get us a foothold on Har HaBayis and not to relinquish it completely. כדי שנוכל להפגין שם נוכחות יהודית מתמדת ולשמור כל הרבונות היהודית עליו כעל בבת עינינו. So that we can demonstrate that there is a constant Jewish presence and to affirm and assert our authority over this place and protect it like our own eye. יש להחזיר העטרה של פסקת עשר הקדושות למקומה במקום קודש הקודשים. And that's why we have to return the crown of Shel Piskat Eser HaKadoshot to this lofty place of 10 holinesses, to its place in the place of the Holy of Holies. And he goes on. I don't think that I need to read the entire, the rest of it for you to understand what is the driving force behind Rav Goren's motivation to even be cholek with his own Rebbe, Rav Avraham Yitzchak Kook, the first chief rabbi of Israel. Rav Kook, as we won't have time to see it inside today, but he has an extremely long tshuva in his Shilos Tshuvas Mishpat Kohen, and I just photocopied for you in source number 4, the last page, Just that you can see that his maskana is that we paskin like the Rambam, and a person bisman hazeh therefore is not supposed to go up to Har HaBayit. Now, I should point out that in the Chakira article that I used for many of my sources, they do point out that Rav Kook's grandson was quoted as saying that they did not protest if the Talmidim went up to Har HaBayis. In other words, despite the psak that is written in his Shilas and Shuvah Sefer, both the older Rav Kook and Rav Kook's son, the Rosh Yeshiva of Yeshivata Rav Kook, they also they didn't they looked. It sounds like they looked the other way. America's a Rab, right? It sounds like they did not make an active protest to stop people from going. But with all of that said, Ein lanu ela ma poskim omrim. All we have is what the poskim say. And so therefore today we're going to start with Rabbi Ovadia Yosef's tshuva. And he writes this shortly after the 67 war. And again, I have to tell you that I'm very conflicted over this because I completely sympathize with Rav Goren's sentiments from a political and a religious standpoint as well. But at the same time, if the psak halacha comes down on the side of Asr, then I don't think that I would be prepared to go against the majority psak. And a person has to really follow his own conscience. But I would tell you, so that's really where I'm headed. It's just that you should understand where our journey, where our destination is. So this is in Yabia Omer, and as you can see, the Tshuvas on source number 2 was written in Tafshin Chav Zayin and Sivan. So this is mamish right after the 67 war. And he writes on just the beautiful opening paragraph. It's just so inspiring to read it. He says, "B'hiyot Ivayomim Eila Hifli Hashem Yisbarach Chasadav V'Nifla Osav Imanu." That during this time, Hashem, and he's writing this days after the liberation of Jerusalem and the Har HaBayis. So it's mamish. It's a historical document as well. He says, during the last few days, God has done tremendous wonders with His kindness, v'niflaos of Imanu, and His great wonders with us. Gabar aleinu chasto, and His kindness has has completely taken us over. V'ra'uchol afsei oretz eis yeshuas Elokeinu. And all of the dwellers of the world have seen the salvation of our Lord. Ki lo yitosh Hashem es amo ba'avur shemo hagadol. That God will not forsake His nation for the sake of His great name. Vayotzienu me'afela le'ora u'miyagon le'simcha. God has taken us from darkness to light, from dread to joy. Baruch hu u'mevorach shemo asher sam nafshenu b'chayim v'lo nasan lamot ragleinu. Blessed is God that has placed our souls back into the living and has not allowed us to lose our foothold. Uverov rachamav v'chasadav zachinu gam l'shichruro shel hakotel hama'aravi. And through God's great kindness, we have merited the liberation of the Kosel. Sarid Beis Mikdashenu v'sif artenu, which is the remnant of our Beis HaMikdash and our glory. Now, by the way, is the Kotel the remnant of our Beit HaMikdash? No. It's the remnant of the outer wall of the Temple Mount. Yeah. So let's keep that in mind. Rav Ovadia is not oblivious to this, but keep that in mind. The Radvaz felt that it was one of the supporting walls of the actual temple itself, but archaeology has basically shown us that that's not the case. V'af kol shetach har habayit v'hamikdash netunim heima b'chasot shelton Yisrael. And now the entire Har HaBayis and the temple are now under the control, the governmental control of the Medina, of the Jewish people. And therefore I'm going to deliberate over whether a person can enter into the place of the temple bisman hazeh, and whether a person should publicize that it is not okay to do this, in order to prevent any michshol, any kind of stumbling block from those who are charedim lidvar Hashem, who really tremble at the word of God and want to always do the right thing. And I guess that's where I'm coming from. I feel this sense of apprehension to find a heter because of this charedim lidvar Hashem. I mean, we're talking about number one, an Isser Kares, and even if you obviate the Isser Kares, we're talking about the Makom HaShechina, so it's like a very scary thing. And also we have to clarify whether you can take an airplane or a helicopter over the place of the HaBayis, because the Kedusha, are you allowed to fly over the Temple Mount and to take pictures and so forth? Are you allowed to look close up to the holy place from above, an aerial view, or should that also be usher? So therefore I'm going to go over this issue, and God should help me. So we're skipping a lot. And the first part of the Tshuva is where he quotes the Rambam, the Machlokes, the Rambam and the Ravid that we had learned last week and that we just spoke out at the beginning. And then he says, "Ubi ikar chiluko shel harambam ben kedushas Eretz Yisrael lekedushas Yerushalayim v'hamikdash." Regarding this distinction that the Rambam draws between the holiness of Eretz Yisrael and the holiness of Yerushalayim in the temple, where because of the Shechina, because the Shechina never departed, the Kedusha of Yerushalayim in the temple is permanent. Shekosev harayvit shesvaras atzmo hizu v'lo yadati minole. So the Rabbi had said, where did the Rambam get this from? He made up this distinction himself. He says, Hinei l'chora yesh hochacha lazeh. So first of all, Rabbi Ovadia says, I believe that he does have a source for this, and he starts quoting several Gemaras. And then he quotes another proof. Va'od mima shesiyem hakasuv achar zeh, v'lo ariach bereach nichochachem. That if you look at the Tochacha says that I will destroy your temple, and I will no longer imbibe your savory fragrance of your sacrifices. So there's a very important Maimer Chazal. He says, Ume'achar shehein shomemin mehechan yihiyeh reach nichoach. He says, if the temple is already destroyed, like as the pasuk says, then how can the pasuk therefore then afterwards say, and I will not imbibe the savory fragrance of your sacrifices? Where would I think that God could imbibe the fragrance of our sacrifices if the temple is already gone? Ergo, you can have sacrifices without having a temple. Because otherwise it would go without saying that once the temple is destroyed, God can no longer imbibe the savory fragrance. So, Hevi Omer Shemakriven Af Alpi She'en Sham BAYT. So you see from the pasuk itself that you're allowed to bring karbanos even though there's no longer a temple. V'lachein Hizhir Shebechol Zos Lo Ariach Berech Nichochachem. And he says, by the way, he says, this is not my own proof. He says, V'chein katav Mari Chagiz Ve'etz HaChaim V'chein Mashmi Mashakatav Sefer Eshkol. And he goes on and on. The beautiful thing about Rabbi Ovadia is he had such bikiyus. He has Baruch Hashem. He should live long and have a richus yamim. He has such a photographic memory that half of the tshuva is saying, see here, see here, see here, see here, see here. And he's got this unbelievable encyclopedic memory to support every argument he makes with multiple sources. So that's where we're cutting through a lot of the tshuva. So that's point number one. He says the Ravid's question on the Rambam, where does the Rambam get this idea that the Kedusha has never left the Beis HaMikdash? It's very clear from the pasuk itself. The pasuk says that there can be korbanos even in the absence of a temple. And the only way that you can bring a korban is if the Shechina is still there. Otherwise, you can't bring a korban. So the Kedusha of the Makom HaMikdash must still be there. Because we're not allowed to bring korbanos willy-nilly anywhere that we want. So the fact that the Torah still allows for the bringing of a korban on the Makom HaMikdash means that the Kedusha is still there. Okay, paragraph Gimel. Ela shalicha ora yesh lahir midivrei hamidrash. And by the way, Rav Goren brings this midrash as well. He says, perhaps you could cite something from the following midrash. The midrash is going on the pasuk in Sefer Shmos, which says, Umoshe haya ro'eh, that Moshe was a shepherd for the flock of his father-in-law Yisro. And then the pasuk says, Hahu dichsiv v'Hashem behichal kadsho. This is what the pasuk means when it says that God is in His holy tabernacle. Amar Reb Shmuel bar Nachmani. So Reb Shmuel bar Nachmani, the Medrash says, Ad shelo charev Beit HaMikdash hayta shechina shuruya b'tocho. Before the temple was destroyed, the divine presence dwelled inside the temple. Mishacharev Beis HaMikdash nistalka shechina la shamayim. But once the temple was destroyed, the Shekhinah departed and it ascended to heaven. Shenemar Hashem b'shamayim hechin kis'o. As it says in the pasuk that God has prepared his throne in heaven. So what do you see from here? You see from here that the Shekhinah is no longer present in the Temple Mount, at least according to Rabbi Shmuel bar Nachmani. Rabbi Acha Amar lo zazer Shekhinah mitocha heichal v'chulei afal pishu charev hu b'kedushaso. Rabbi Acha disagrees with Rabbi Shmuel, and he says no, even after the temple's destruction, the Shekhinah is still there. It hasn't moved. Amar Rabbi Elazar, la'olam lo zazer Shekhinah mikosel ma'aravi. And Rabbi Elazar says, I'm not going to address the Makom HaMikdash, but I can tell you this, the Shekhinah has never left the Kosel HaMa'aravi, the western wall. That's the end of the Medrash. Okay? Now, says Rabbi Ovadia, Hareshi Ikar Ta'amo Shel Harambam, Sheshchina Eina B'Teila La'olam Shanui B'Machlokes. So you see very clearly that there seems to be a machlokes on the very issue that the Rambam is suggesting. Remember, the Rambam's whole point is that since the Shekhinah has never departed from the Temple Mount, then even after the temple's destruction, the Kedusha is still there. Comes along Rabbi Ovadia and says, no, you see, it's a machlokes.
It begs the question why the Rabbi would say, where's the Rambam getting it from? Because you have to
okay, it's a good point. So the Rabbi probably has a different way of learning this medrash, as Rabbi Ovadia will tell us in just a minute. Uladas Reb Shmuel bar Nachmani nistalka shchina lachar hachurban ulefizeh batla kedushas hamikdash kedas haravid. And therefore he says that there is no longer kedusha, and that seems to be the position of the Ravid. So the Ravid has a basis, and the Rambam has a basis. Now we skip. He says Biram. Just skip the paragraph. Biram lakush the parentheses. Biram lakushta the milsa nira she'ein mizeraya laharavid. However, I believe that this midrash is talking about something totally different. And it's got nothing to do with the Kedusha, the halachic Kedusha, that is being differentiated in the Rambam and the Ravid. She'en kavanas Rav Shmuel bar Nachmani shenistalka misham hashechina latzemitut. That Rav Shmuel bar Nachmani is not suggesting that there was a complete removal of the Shechina after the Churban HaBayis. Ela ba'ofan zmani bilvad. But rather, it was only a temporary removal, meaning that according to Shmuel bar Nachmani, when the temple was destroyed, God said, I'm leaving. But he didn't leave permanently. He just left for a moment and then came back. After they destroyed it, then Hashem came back. And here he says, he brings from another Gemara. The Gemara in Sanhedrin says that Ammon and Moab, in the times towards the end of the first temple, they went to Nebuchadnezzar, and they said, please Nebuchadnezzar, destroy the temple. Ki ein ha'ish b'veiso, because God is no longer in his house. Kolomar shenistalka hashchina, meaning that the divine presence has left. Uvepesichta da'echa rabasi, b'shah shebikesh HaKadosh Baruch Hu la'achariv espeis hamikdash omar, kol zman shani b'socho ein akum noge imbo, asalek shchinasi ve'ele lemechoni harishon. We also have a medrash in Eicha Rabbah, which says that God said that when it was time for him to destroy his temple, his presence departed temporarily in order to enable for the destruction. Meaning that what Rav Shmuel bar Nachmani is saying is that in order for the temple to have even the ability to be destroyed, it was necessary for the Shekhinah to temporarily depart so that it would allow for the destruction. That's what he's saying. But of course, once the temple was destroyed and the enemy accomplished its task, Hashem returned, even according to Rabbi Shmuel bar Nachmani. As it says in the pasuk and cited by the Gemara, that this is my permanent resting place. And that's why when the divine presence returned itself to the second temple, they instituted a bracha, and they said, Baruch atah Hashem, hamachazir shechina so l'tzion, that God returns his Shekhinah to Zion. So now already you're seeing that Rabbi Ovadia connects this to prayer. This has a very important ramification in how we daven. When you and I say hamachzir shechina so l'tzion, are we talking about a future event that has not yet occurred? Or are we referring to a historical event that has already occurred and that is occurring on a continual basis, that God is constantly placing His divine presence in Zion? So do you see how this has very important ramifications in even Kavanas HaTfilah? So, ve'afal pisha amru biyoma chamisha dvarim chasru b'bayis sheni aron kaporos uchruvim eish china v'urim v'tumim. So he says, but wait a minute. The Gemara itself says that there was a lower level of Shekhinah in the second temple from the first temple, because there were 5 essential instruments that are necessary for the Shekhinah to be present in the temple. And what were those 5 things? The Aron, the Kapores, the ark cover, the Kruvim, the cherubs on top of the ark cover, Eish Shekhinah, the fire of the divine presence was therefore not present, and Urim V'tumim, and the Urim V'tumim. There was not the permanent fire on the altar. So you see from here that Hine Milvad Shebirushalmi Isa Hey Devarim Haya Hamikdash Ha'acharon Chasam Min Harishon Eish Aron V'Urim V'tumim Shemen HaMishcha B'Ruach HaKodesh. The Yerushalmi lists a different 5 items, but the point is V'hanu D'chsiv V'Erev Sebo V'Ikavadayin Sham V'lo Nizkar Sham Shechasra Shechina. But he says over there in the Yerushalmi, it never says that the Shechina was lacking. Ogei Shlomar. But so first of all, so Rabbi Avadia says, first of all, it's the Yerushalmi never says that the Shechina left, even though the Bavli says that it seems to have left because it says Eish Shechina, the fire of the divine presence. However, he says Og Yesh Lomar Ki Madregos Yesh B'Hashras HaShechina. And this is what Rav Gorin says also in his Sefer. He says that it is possible to suggest that there are different levels of Shechina. The term Shechina refers to a divine presence which is more spatially confined in one area than another. But you could have intense divine presence, and you can have minor divine presence. I mean, think about it for a second. Think about radiation. If you say this place is irradiated, well, how many, what is it, what is the gradation, what, rads, what is it? How many rads? Is it 1 million rads? Is it 5 million rads? So the Shekhinah is the same thing, right? In other words, there are different gradations of Shekhinah presence at different stages in history. And we see that there are different gradations of prophecy, so there are different gradations of Shekhinah. The Zohar also says that in the first temple there was the upper Shekhinah present, and in the second temple there was the lower Shekhinah that was present. But there's no question that in the second temple there was a Shekhinah. So it's very clear, he says, that only in relation to the first temple do we say that the Shekhinah departed. But it's that higher level of Shekhinah that we're referring to, not the base level of Shekhinah that would halachically preclude us from going there, that the Rambam is referring to. So do you see how he's demonstrating that this medrash is not really addressing the machlokes, the Rambam, and the Ravid? Okay, is that clear? And then he goes through several other midrashim and agadata. He goes through the famous agadata in Maseches Brachos that Rabbi Shmuel ben Elisha Kohen Gadol, who was in the times of the Second Temple. He says that I once entered into the Kodesh HaKadoshim on Yom Kippur, and I heard the voice of one of the Akasriel Ka, right, Hashem Tzavakos, Sheyoshev al Kisei Rama Benisa. I heard the voice of some emanation or some manifestation of HaKadosh Baruch Hu himself, saying to me, Yishmael b'ni barcheni, saying, Yishmael, my son, give me a bracha. So how could that happen if there was no Shekhinah in the Second Temple? So this is another demonstration. And he goes through demonstration after demonstration. And, okay, we'll go on. Let's go to the next paragraph, just because of time constraints. ומכל מקום ודאי שאין האורס השכינה בזמן החורבן כאשר הייתה באמנה איתו בזמן שהיה בית המקדש בנוי לתלפיות. There's no question that the emanation or the irradiation of the light of the Shekhinah is not the same today as it was when we had a structure standing in that place. And that's why the Gemara in Brachos says that a person should not be in a state of levity when he's standing in front of the eastern gate of the temple. But that's only true from a certain point inwards and where the gate is visible and when there's no impediment blocking your view. And also it's only true when the Shekhinah is present. So you see very clearly, V'chein pasak harambam b'zeh l'shono, b'zman she'hamikdash banoi, asur lo la'adam lahakil rosha min hatzofim v'lifnim. V'hu she'yeroeh es hamikdash ve'en gader mafsik beino ve'en hamikdash. He says, when the Rambam himself distinguishes between when the temple is standing and when the temple is not standing. He says that when the temple is standing, and you can visibly see from the doorway of the eastern gate, which is the main entranceway into the temple, and you can see clearly in, so then that's at that place where it's visible, the entrance to the temple, you're not allowed to be in a state of levity. You have to be very sober. So you see, Alma Shachar Achurban Ein Lahak Pipach Cholzeh. So you see that even according to the Rambam, you don't have to worry about levity because there's not the same level of Shechina. V'hagam Rabbi Yochanan Asmo Spilei to Kedusha Rishona Kitshel Asid Lavo. And Rabbi Yochanan himself, we know from other Gemaras, holds that the sanctity of the Temple Mount is eternal. So isn't that a bit of a contradiction? And he explains no. He says, Afilu Hachi Mechalek Bein Kisha HaMikdash Kayam Beila Achar Churban. So you see that he himself, even if you hold that the Kedusha of the Makom HaMikdash is eternal and is unchanging, nevertheless you can distinguish in certain other subtle halachic distinctions between when the temple is standing and when the temple is not standing. As we explained, there are different gradations of Shechina. And that's why the Rambam can paskin that way as well, even though he holds that the Shechina has never left. Umikol makom, anytime you see three dots, it means I'm skipping a chunk, okay? So, umikol makom, me'achar shegam b'churbano b'kedusha sa'omeid, asu lahakil rosho b'tchum HaBayis atzmo, lihikones b'minalo uva'apundaso, v'lasoso kapandaria urikika. And he says, even after the temple is destroyed, when you come more proximal to the actual place of the temple, there's still, of where the temple stood, there still is a halacha that you're not allowed to have levity. In other words, when the temple was standing, then any place where you could see the temple, even if you were at a distance, like standing on Har HaZeisim, you still would not be allowed to be in a state of levity. That halacha no longer applies, but on the Temple Mount itself, you're still not allowed to do certain things which are casual, or which give rise to levity. V'zeu shekosav harambam, apol pisha mikdash charev hayom ba'avonoseinu harabim, chayev adam b'mora'o, that even though the temple is destroyed, unfortunately, due to our sins, the Rambam says this person still has to have a sense of morah, still has a sense of awe and reverence, as if it were still standing. He's only allowed to go to a place where he's permitted to, meaning where if the temple were standing, he would not be allowed to go any further. He's not allowed to sit in the area of where the temple courtyard. Nor if he's right up against where the eastern gate used to stand, he cannot be in a state of levity. And based on the drasha that the Gemara makes, that the Torah at the end of Parshas Kedoshim, or I think at the end of Parshas Kedoshim says, observe my Shabbases and fear my temples, or fear my temple. So what's the connection between Shabbos and the Beis HaMikdash? Just like the Shabbos observance is eternal, so too is Mora Mikdash, so too is having a sense of reverence for the temple an eternal law, even in the absence of the Beis HaMikdash. Yeah. So what Rabbi Ovadia has demonstrated is that even if you hold like the Rambam, the Kedusha Rishona Kitchel Shaita, the Kitchel Asid Lavo, that the sanctification of Jerusalem is an eternal phenomenon, nevertheless you can still distinguish in certain more subtle halachic principles based upon the different gradations of Shechina that exist before the destruction and after the destruction. But the Shechina is still always there. Maybe not 5 million rads, maybe only 1 million rads, okay? Okay, so let's go on to the next paragraph. Anyone want to jump in at all? Anyone?
Rabbi,
Yeah.
just a quick, from the pasuk as Shem Sasai Tishmar Mikdash Tirav, it doesn't. You don't necessarily draw that even at this when the temple is no longer around, because Mikdash could mean when it was still a standing structure.
No, the connection is because Shabbos is an eternal observance. Shabbos, just like Shabbos is not dependent upon there being any physical structure, it is an eternal law for all generations. So too, the awe that one has to have of the base of the Makom HaMikdash, eternal and not contingent upon there being certain structures. Okay?
How does Rav Goren get around it? This is not something that
Rav Goren is going to have to rely on the Ravid. The Ravid Shita, at the end of the day, is really the only thing that I'm aware of that you can rely on if you want to be able to enter into the area of the Har HaBayis, or I shouldn't say that. Even if you hold like the Rambam, so as I mentioned, there's two issues here. One issue is there are areas of the Har HaBayis that are not of the Temple Mount, that are not part of the original Har HaBayis. So that's the first issue. And if Rav Goren has this driving need to assert our authority, then at least one might be able to argue, as long as you could delineate the areas which are not part of the original Har HaBayis, then that would be one thing. Okay? But that would not bring you up to the Dome of the Rock, right? Another issue that one could argue is that I could be a Tmei Meis and still go on the original Har HaBayis. I can't have Tumas Zav and Tumas Nida.
But he doesn't address that. He's just basing it based on security. That means that everybody that
No. Rav Goren is a halachist par excellence. He's never going to tell us that you can just ignore the halacha.
Well, he didn't say that I guess that's just abbreviated.
It's a whole book.
Okay.
I just gave you one page of the book just to be able to demonstrate Rav Goren's motivation for pushing forward for a heter. He says he feels driven to find a heter however he can find it so that the Jewish people maintain their dominion over the Makom HaMikdash. And this will keep us strong, in his opinion. Okay? He goes through the rest of the book, right? He asked Shraga to borrow his sefer. He goes through mamish, a whole sefer, going through different arguments as to why one should not be permitted to do it. Okay? But we're just going through Rabbi Ovadia now. Okay.
So are we just at the point where we're trying to get into the sense of the Machne Shechina?
Yes, Rabbi Ovadia is telling us why we paskin like the Rambam. He's demonstrating that. The very end of the tshuva, he's going, and what we'll do is, I guess because we want to make sure that we get to the end, here's what I'm going to do. Tell you what I'm going to do. Let's just go to the last paragraph of Rabbi Ovadia. There's some fascinating historical things that he brings. So I don't know if we're going to get to it yet. I don't know if I'll have time, but we'll see. But let's just go to paragraph Yud Aleph, where he says as follows. It's on the bottom of one of the pages, where the paragraph that starts with Yud Aleph. You see that? Yeah. So he says, Hamuram mikol ha'amur, shahadin noten lipsok kedivrei harambam v'rov harishonim v'ha'achronim, shekedusha rishona kidsha gam la'asid lavod. So what comes out after all of this very lengthy discussion is that we definitely paskin like the Rambam. He even points out, by the way, he says the Meiri's testimony that there were people going into the Makom, to the Har HaBayis during his time, it's not a reliable testimony. He says there were Yechidim then. You know how many Jews there were in Yerushalayim in the lifetime of the Meiri? There was probably less than 1 million. He shows this from the Ramban, who lived shortly before the Meiri. He says, the Ramban goes to Eretz Yisrael and he says that there's B'tzimtzum, the Koshi, there's 1 million that get on Shabbos of Mispal in Yerushalayim. So you're going to bring a raya from there that if a few Yiddelach go up to Har HaBayis, you can't necessarily bring proof from that. He also brings a Maisa of Rav Moses Montefiore. Amazing. If we have time, I want us to take a look at it. But let's just go to the Maskana of Rabbi Ovadia. And he says, Hamura mikol ha'amor shahadin nos litzok kedivrei harambam v'rov harishonim v'achronim shekedusha rishona kidsha gam la'asid lavo v'lachein asur li'ikonis bizman hazeh l'makam ha'mikdash. And therefore today you cannot enter the place of the temple, biglal heyosenu timei mesim, because we are all tumas meis. And then he goes further. He says, "V'gam v'asur gam latus l'rachayt b'matos b'masok, helicopter ba'avir makom hamikdash." You also may not go in a plane or a helicopter over the Beis HaMikdash, because Rabbi Ovadia demonstrates that the Kedusha goes up ad la shamayim, up to heaven, as well. Okay? U'mitzvah rabba lefarsem ha'isur u'lahodia l'rabim she'avon karetu v'lo yikashlu be'isur chamor zeh. It is therefore a mitzvah to publicize this and to make sure that people understand that there's an Isur Kares involved. The Tanya b'Tosefta Amar Rabbi Shimon Kosher Tumas Mikdash b'Kadosh of Yosef Mikol Averot Shabbat Torah. And as he quotes from the Tosefta, that Rabbi Shimon says the Avera of entering into the temple in the state of Tumah is the most difficult Avera in the Torah.
But he said here L'makam HaMikdash.
I understand. I'm getting there, later. I got you. I already jumped to paragraph Yud Aleph. Give me a chance. Shekol Avera Shebetorah Miskapros Pamechas Bashana, because and to prove it, he says all sins you get an atonement for on Yom Kippur. However, B'Tumas Mikdash V'Kadasha Miskapres B'Chol Chodesh B'Chodesh Ayin Sham. He says, but we know that the reason why they bring a Korban Chatas on Rosh Chodesh, one of the reasons is to atone for Tumas Mikdash V'Kadasha, is to atone for people who entered into the temple in the state of Tumah. So you see that it's a much more onerous sin if it needs a monthly atonement versus an annual atonement for other sins on Yom Kippur. V'lachein asuli kanes, and this is where we get to the punchline. Therefore, Rabbi Ovadia says, "V'lachein asuli kanes bisman hazel HaBayit afilu la'achar tefila b'min alo uva'avak shal gabi raglav." So first of all, you have a problem. Even if you went to the mikveh and you alleviated tumas keri and tumas zav and tumas nida, you still have a problem. You can't go with your shoes and your walking stick, because that's one of the things that is required. That's one of the types of casualness that is not permitted on the Temple Mount. Nor can you just go up to there to act as a tourist, because that's one of the other things that is usher. Sharei af legabi beis hakneses ubeis hamidrash shaninu bibraisa ein metailin bohem vein nichnasin bohem. So stamazoi, just to go up there to have a look-see, even in a synagogue you're not supposed to do. You can only go up to a dvar mitzvah. So one could argue with Rabbi Ovadia over here and say, okay, so I'm not going as a tourist. I want to have a religious experience. I want to daven mincha at the HaBayis, right? Okay. So, but anyway, he says, "V'hinei gam zelo hutar af la'achar shetava lekiryo el l'chutz l'makom ha'azarot." He says, and even if you're going to argue, okay, so I'll daven, I'll do a mitzvah on HaBayis, but you still have to go to mikvah for tumas keri, and you're only allowed to stand outside where the azara, where the temple courtyard was standing. And you have to go back even further, since we don't know exactly where that place is. You're going to have to distance yourself very seriously in order to avoid even the possibility of trespassing and going beyond where you're supposed to go. And you're not going to know. He says, he says, and the truth is, it's very difficult for us to be able to demarcate exactly where that point is. And he says, take a look. He says, even though the Rabbi says that the stone that they call the Eben HaShisiya, the Kipat HaSela, the Al-Sakra, which is the Dome of the Rock, Hi HaEben HaShisiya, Shalehu HaYaram Bebeis Kodesh HaKadoshim. He says, even though if you were to take the Radbaz's statement as gospel, that the stone of the Dome of the Rock is the place of the Kodesh HaKadoshim, he says, he says, but that's not so clear that the Even Shisiya is the place of the Kodesh HaKadoshim. That itself is disputed among the authorities. Even though we know that the western wall is the western wall of the Temple Mount, and not like the Radbaz says, which that it was the courtyard, the temple courtyard wall. And therefore you should for sure say, well, I can go behind the Kosel HaMaravi, because there's for sure 150. There's a Tafkuf. There's 500 amos from the Kosel, the entrance of the Temple Mount to the Azara. He says, "Mikol makom harei en yadua lanu hamerchak shebein hakotel ma'ari lekotel beit hakodesh hakodeshim." But we still don't know the distance between the kosel and the Kodesh HaKadoshim. He says, and that's why I hold, says Rabbi Ovadia, that a person should not enter the HaBayis even after going to the mikveh, and even if he wants to do a mitzvah like prayer up on the Temple Mount. Because invariably what's going to happen is, by you going up, by Rabbi so-and-so with the long aborts going up to the HaBayis, all the Jews are going to say, oh, it's okay for me to go. They're not going to take the proper precautions. They're going to go further than they're supposed to go. And people will be having levity on the HaBayis. The Alfi Inshi Mikal Kalta V'lo Mitakanta. He says, as the saying goes, people learn to mimic bad behavior. They don't learn to mimic good behavior, is essentially what the Aramaic statement is. V'cha'es kvar nimnu v'gazu v'iskim gedolei hador b'chol tokef ligdor gedru la'azir ba'azara chamura lebal yahin shum adam likanes l'shetach HaBayis ad ki yavo Shiloh. He says, and this is the consensus of the Gedolim, that we should not go up to the HaBayis until the third temple is built. Sha'az yukuyam banu, and the Zarakti aleichem mayim tahor mutahartem, that at that time we'll have the water of purity sprinkled upon us and we'll be purified. V'shomei alanu yishkon betach v'shem yisparach yachish l'galenu gula shlema nachon yebeis Hashem barosh harim va'pirin al mechon yeshev v'Yisrael nashav Hashem teshuas olamim amen. And he ends up with the flowery language, may our geula happen very, very speedily. So Rabbi Ovadia is very clear. So Lazer, that answers your question. In other words, he says, yes, it's true. There's definitely place for a person to go if he's very, very careful, if he goes to mikveh and he's only going up to do a mitzvah. And you could at least stand on the other side of the kosel. That would for sure be okay. But, at the end of the day, the Gedolim have said not to do it. And they said so for good reason. Because even though you know what you're doing, 10 other people who are going to see you going up are not going to know all of the precautions that you've taken. Now, it's possible, by the way, Rav Goren counteracts this argument. And he says, so tell me something, which is worse? Is it worse for the Temple Mount to be trampled by Jews who don't know what they're doing? Or is it better for it to be trampled by Arabs playing soccer and doing all kinds of foreign prayer? So his argument is basically that. He says, listen, if we can take it back and sanctify it to whatever degree we can by girding it under Jewish control and having Jews there, that would be better. However, that argument, I have to confess, in my smallness, that argument does not completely resonate with me, because halacha is halacha. You can't say, well, we have to do the lesser of two evils in order to prevent. The halacha was not given to the HaBayis. The halacha was given to me. I have to observe halacha. My responsibility, therefore, primarily is on my personal obligations of observance, and not to make sure that the HaBayis is protected from Arabs playing soccer. And if there's a conflict between the two, then I have to take my own halachic observance more seriously. Even as painful as that sounds, as sort of difficult as that may sound when you first hear it, but at least I think that's what Rabbi Ovadia would say. Just to finish off, let's... Yeah.
See, he says two ideas. One, maybe this was written in Sivan, 1967.
Yes.
Where he suggests that maybe we don't know exactly, but I think today...
There have been a lot more archaeological studies.
You can get around that. And that might also help with a second svara, which is now you're going to cause a takala to the greater the rabbin. The reality is that perhaps if people now know and they are demarcated, then perhaps I'm not making I'm just saying.
I hear you. The first point I hear you're making, but I think still at the present we do not have demarcations. The Arabs who control the Waqf would never allow us to demarcate on the Temple Mount where up until here you can go. So it's a non-starter. If that taka were true, that we had the ability to put up signs and say, Shitas Rav so-and-so ad kan, right? And Shitas, the Chazani Shiur is ad kan, whatever you're going to say, right? If we had those signs, I think that would be a valid argument to make. The reality is, though, is that from a practical basis, there's no way to get those signs up. The second you put that sign up, it'll go down.
But those that go,
but the guys go.
When they do go, that's what they do.
Yes, correct. Correct. They are very careful. And
that's precisely Goren's argument.
Right.
Because he's saying if we took possession again, we took control and dominion, then we could put up those signs.
Right. So it's sort of a catch-22. Yeah. Okay, I just want to go over it, the Vakasha. With the last few minutes that we have, let's take a look at the story of Rav Moses Montefiore for just a second. Go back to the Tshuva of Rabbi Ovadia. It's above that same page where we started paragraph Yud Aleph. Let's go to paragraph Ches. And he says, V'hine ra'isi laharav, I don't know, Chanina, I'm not sure who this is, Hershenson, the Sefer Malki Bakodesh, Chelak Aleph, Shehivias Asipor al Sarat Sadik, Rav Pi'ilim Rav Moshe Montefiore Zal. He brings a story about the great Sir, the Tzaddik, the great person who did great things for the city of Yerushalayim, Rav Moses Montefiore. Shekasher Bola Eretz Yisrael Yachadim Rabo Dr. Levi Zal, Bishnas Hey Tafresh Kaf Zayin. What year is that in the secular calendar?
1867.
Okay, 1867. Okay. So Nichnasu Lamakom HaMikdash. He came to the Temple Mount. And once the word got out that Rav Moshe Montefiore went up to the HaBayis, so Ba'az Hayab Yerushalayim Reb Yoseph Moshe Milisa, he was the son of the Gaon Milisa, the author of the Chavos Das. Lokach Shofar, the Taka B'chutzot Yerushalayim V'nida et Hasar. So he took a shofar, he blew the shofar, and he immediately put Rav Moshe Montefiore into Cherem. Ubiyot Hasar Yarei Hashem Ma'od. Now Rav Moshe Montefiore was a God-fearing Jew. So Pana Yachadim Rabbo El Rabbanei Yerushalayim. So he went to the rabbis of Jerusalem at the time with great trepidation. Vayitnatzlu ki asu zot b'tom libam al pi heter harayvitzal. And they said, why did they put us in Cherem? We were innocent. We didn't mean to do anything, any trespass. We did this because we were somech on the Ravid, like the Meiri said. So the rabbis of Yerushalayim calmed them down. And they basically said that the Cherem of Rabbi Yosef Moshe is like the Cherem of the Yam, of the ocean, meaning it's meaningless. Because the word Yam is Yosef Moshe. Basically what they were saying is he's an old man, he's a little bit senile, and he's a bit of a, in his old age he's become a little bit yeah, that's a good word. And so therefore they shouldn't worry about his chayim. Ad kan tochen devarav. Ve'emes shahadavar barur shelo kivnu gaonei Yerushalayim lomar shekedin asa hasar shebikir b'makom hamikdash. They certainly did not mean to say that it was okay what Sir Moshe Montefiore had done. Hefech das harambam ve'harosh v'rov haposkim. They're not suggesting that it was okay for him to go against the Rambam and the majority of the poskim. But they were just saying that because you did it b'shogeg, so then you don't deserve to be put into Cherem. She'omer mutar dino kishogeg, because anyone who says that something is mutar, he has the din of a shogeg. Now, and then he quotes from another sefer that states that he was the first person to have the chutzpah to go up to the HaBayis, and he spent a lot of money to shmeichel the Islamic leader, and he did this against the ratzon of the Chachamim, and there's a lot of criticism that was stated about Rav Moshe Montefiore because of this. But then he goes into paragraph number 9, paragraph Tes. He says, Ach kemeduma li sheshamati b'yaldusi shahasar v'rabo nichnasu l'makom hamikdash al yedei shidat teva u'migdal. He says, however, I believe that I remember hearing when I was a kid that they put him in a box, because this is the way, by the way, that a Kohen can get through a Beis HaKvaros, right? Mm-hmm. If you put the Kohen in a box, so you sort of protect him from the outside tumah, or if he's tumah, he can be protected from transmitting tumah to the outside.
That's only for tumah samid, though, isn't it? Or is it for all tumah?
I think it's for all tumah, because it creates a chatzitza. Okay. It's a chatzitza for the tumah from getting out. So she nisa'um goyim, and he had non-Jews carry him, so that he was okay. But he says, however, and basically the rationale is that the airspace of the Beis Hamikdash does not have Kedusha, only the ground. And as long as he's not making physical contact with the ground, then he's okay. And then Rabbi Obadja goes on to demonstrate that this is not correct also. Factually, this is incorrect. And that really the airspace of the Azara also has Kedusha. And it's on that basis that he proves that you cannot fly over with a helicopter or an airplane. I don't, I mean, that's the thing, is that it's pretty clear that the Western Wall is not the original Makom HaBayis, it's not the original Temple Mount. So, but again, it could be that the person says, listen, if you go into the wall and you're still at Tumas Keri, then maybe there is basis to say it. I'm not sure. I haven't really spoken to someone about it to really verify this.
I think Rav Moshe talks about you're not supposed to lean on it.
Oh, is that right?
Yeah.
I copied for you a tshuva from Rav Moshe as well. The reason why I didn't find this tshuva compelling is because Rav Moshe only speaks theoretically in the tshuva, and I don't think he meant it halacha l'maisa. But you'll take a look at the tshuva from Rav Moshe as well. Okay?